Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook. The Waterfront. Hello there. We've spoken from time to time of the old Aberdeen and the old Hoquiam, the little waterfront towns of the late 1890s and the early years of the 20th century that were known to seafaring men as Plank Island, and that roared with a continuous, almost monotonous sound that was half human and half gale in its source. And we have said that no place on the face of the earth, in no strata of our loosely stacked history, was there ever more color and romance than on the waterfronts of our towns. Oh, we know the stories of New Bedford and her sailing ships, and we've prowled the New Bedford waterfront. We've cruised along the rock-strewn beach at Falmouth and eyed the misty form of Martha Vineyards across the Sound. We've seen Narragansett and Gloucester and the docks at Norfolk and San Francisco, but none, in their wildest days, in their hours of most colorful greatness, ever exceeded in human interest the Grays Harbor that old-timers knew in the early years of the century. We have mentioned Barroom Row, but unless you've once walked down F Street and skirted the town's bistros along River Street, Hume Street, and the alleys between, you are carrying around a diluted picture of a strong drink emporium of those days. For when a century was young, and Aberdeen and Hoquiam beat time to the scuffs of cocked boots on plank sidewalks, before the great fire leveled the old wooden city that was Aberdeen, the swinging doors of the harbor's city fanned the salt-laden air with 1,000 lashes per minute, and the thud of brimming mugs of polished mahogany made time with sailing men's ditties and logging men's yarns. And if you were a seafaring man and you appeared to be on the bark that dropped its hook alongside Aberdeen, you had your choice of such places as Aberdeen Bar, the Blue Front, the Boogedy, Sambo's Place, the Capitol, the Continental, or the Fashion. You might wet your whistle in the Gem Dance Hall, where there was life and gaiety and feminine company, or put your foot on the brass rail of such spots as Mike Goldsmith's, the Grand Saloon, the Heffron, the Horseshoe, Fred Hewitt's, John Cale's, Moose Kaufman's, or the Pioneer. And if you were of a mind to splice the main brace in good company, you could push your way into Leaf and Jacobson's, the Pullman, the Union Bar, the Twins, or Walker's Resort for Gentlemen. However, if your schooner had warped into the dock at Hoquiam, you found your sea legs unlimbering on the plank sidewalks of Hoquiam, you'd be setting out with the crew to find the Club Bar, Elliot's Palace, Dan Heffron's, McLeod's, Elman Olson's, Patton's Place, the Reception Saloon, the Rendezvous, or Hamilton's Russell's Bar, and if they didn't please, there was always Shamrock, Snyder and Glock, Swank's Place, the Tacoma, and Two Jacks, or Thomas and Moberg. Old-timers sometimes recall that there were more saloons than anything else, and they catered to callous-handed, strong-backed men of the woods, the waterfront, and the seven seas with a steady flow of strong drink that those men used to oil the workings of their physical might. Yes, there were many saloons catering to all types and all trades, and when seafaring men and the men of the waterfront wanted to feel at home, they made a beeline for Aberdeen's Royal Bar, the historic meeting place of men of the seven seas, and probably the saltiest, earthiest, most colorful emporium of strong drink that Grays Harbor ever knew. The Royal was a rather pretentious affair in those days. It had a great wide mirror that stemmed at the edge from the rising warmth of humidity and that reflected the long rows of multi-shaped bottles and the haze of blue smoke and the ruddy face of seafaring men. There were innumerable round rings on the bar where the glasses had set, for the trade was always brisk and the towel swipes became shorter and shorter as the calls for refills became more numerous. Big John's reflection in the back bar changed monotonously from back of his head to the face as he methodically pulled and poured and jostled and crowded back and forth. Two other tenders worked as swift at the ends of the long mahogany bar. Say that the ship Daisy had just arrived with her crew, swarthy and salt-bitten, had blown into the Royal for a washdown. They were thirsty with the 100-day thirst born for a long, grueling passage from the antipodes and countless sea meals out of the salt brine and pickle barrels. Staggerly might stop somewhere else, but a gang made it straight track for the Royal, which was the selective magnet that drew the sailors and fishermen to Gray's Harbor's earliest conglomeration of hard-working, hard-fighting, and hard-drinking population. There were those up the street who found little appeal in 3 fingers of straight liquid fire and ribbardarily bare-knuckle fights at the drop of a hat, and they frequented such spots as Walker's, where gold 20s could be stacked a foot high, but wouldn't buy a short beer if a customer conducted himself in an unseemly manner. But along the banks of the Wishkah, there went a continuous caravan of saltwater men from the sea to the oasis, for the Royal was a watering spot for men with a gait of the sea in their stride, and there before Big John's massive bar there congregated men with bulging biceps, clear eyes that were predominantly blue, those huge in stature who knew the rise and fall of the ground swells and the fearsome banging of wind-bereft ship. They plunged through the swinging doors, the doors that seldom hesitated in their quick, jerky movements, with the rolling gait of men long familiar with the feeling of rolling keels beneath their feet. They were the steamermen, coastwise men, and men who knew the lonely trade of offshore fishermen, men who bent sails on barcontents, and men who manned the fore and aft. Seamen, all of them flocked to the Royal to find their cronies, the saltwater hands who had shipped with them on other voyages, toiling at the lines of long-gone crews in the Coral Islands and the Antofagos. And when they found them, they were most certain to do it at the Royal. They spliced main braces in the ruddy vigor of men who liked to play rough games. Here, the seafaring men mingled with the sprinkling of fisher folk with big hands and longshoremen, fraternized with seafaring brotherhood. They talked and joked and swapped yarns and pulled on strong pipes. Here were fellow wayfarers as they talked of ships and seaways. Nearby was a sailors' union hall and its stored locations, the union that had as high as 150 members on the list, men who sought berths on ships that plied the coast and beat down the trades, the palm-fringed islands in the path of the sun, or cast off for a voyage that took them to other ends of the world. Those were the sailing days when the average appraisal of Waterfront would show from 20 to 30 windjammers lying in for the loading, or to have their spars refitted and their new masts stepped out onto the harbor's busy yards. The sailing vessels were hand-loaded, and for the long weeks that the ships lay, the crews became a part of the population of the little cities. Their captains were entertained in the town's best circles, and their crews learned the streets and the resort of the harbor communities and developed seafaring men's routines when in port. John Grunow was a dispatcher for the Sailors' Union, and he kept the list and the records and found jobs for the deep water men before Billy Gould moved in to give the waterfront a new flavor and a new location across the street, and to spread terror and death among the men who went down to the sea. For when Gould came, the roll-licking, roaring waterfront that had bred color and certainty amongst strong-handed, salty romance, and others which flowed with the rhythm of the poet's savor, suddenly changed its temper. Gould's wharf rats roamed the docks, stealing and murdering. Ships' crews were terrorized, beaten, and more than one seaman was found floating in the harbor, the victim of the press gangs that Gould ruled with an iron hand. When Gould went out, after a decade of terrorism, the saltwater waves of the world had undergone a transition. The sailing ship on its way out, the steam schooner hauled the fresh-cut fir timbers from the harbor and southern ports. The big steel traps were beginning to appear, and the commercial organization that spelled neatness and order in things shipping had taken over and were wielding the business of shipmen and men and cargoes into a business in which mere men only were numbers, and the salty, horned, rim-handed men who had strained at lines and beaten down canvases no longer fit. And in the years that followed, shipping became an orderly business, bereft of deeds of the individuals and shorn in the glamour and stately windjammers and adventurous voyages. And with the disappearance of the color of the seafaring life, the color went out of the harbor's waterfront. The great flood of hard-living, strong-talking life was gone. The one-time swashbuckling populace disappeared as mysteriously as the white-winged ships that they had manned. They no longer gathered to swap hotels, good or bad. No salty atmosphere pervaded the rapid growth of modernism that slowly crowded the deep-water men's hangouts more and more into the past. Even the stark walls that frowned down on the long bars where Big John drew and served have gone, and a shuffle of loiterers that replaced the heavy tread of the seaman's boots has gone into the limbo of time. The lingo of the waterfront has lost its salty flavor, and the doors that swung both ways have been replaced with modern counterparts that swing as the law prescribes and when permitted. There is no more boisterous laughter, no swaggering sea dogs, nothing left that savors of the once colorful romance and mad-made roistering that once gave Grays Harbor's waterfront the tang that was historic. For time, which changes all things and all men, has done its work well. The royal has been unceremoniously stowed away, and the lurid sign that beckoned along the waterfront ways has disappeared with the towering wooden buildings that leaned to port and welcomed the washing of seafaring men fresh from the long watches at sea. And today the city of Aberdeen is getting ready to build a park where the boisterous laughter and the hard-handed scoffles of strong living men once made their rich music for the heady, and the ship of a generation that carried each a small slice of color, the tang of Grays Harbor fabulous waterfront, too, have sailed for their last voyages, leaving behind a heritage, tarry smells, salty oaths, and well-spun yarns that outmatch anything the Pacific coast has ever known, and a color of salty kaleidoscope of sounds like old familiar music as we review it tonight as one of our pages in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.